Urban infill is often described as the best way to meet our housing needs, but it seems the majority of Canadians want a single-family home, and most would prefer that to be in the suburbs. So are we actually building the homes people really want? Benji Ketchen is the CEO of Wahi, which conducted the survey. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Were you surprised that this kind of old-fashioned model of housing is still the one that the majority of people have in their minds as what they want?
I think I was a little surprised, but as I reflected upon the findings, I realized that what is old is new again, and it still remains the Canadian dream to have a detached single-family house in the suburbs.
Now, we should note that the numbers for that kind of desire to be in the suburbs were closely followed by people that want to be in a more urban center. Rural really didn't win out in most places, although we should say for some reason in Atlantic Canada, they really would prefer rural. I guess it's because it's so beautiful there. But in terms of kind of the mix.
It is beautiful.
Were you surprised at how there's a disconnect between what we're building in the last few years and what people are looking for? This kind of shoebox condos is not on anybody's dream list.
Well, let's remember that the survey we conducted was the great Canadian dream home. And I think this remains the Canadian dream. The reality is the majority of the growth in the country is occurring in cities, and particularly in large urban centers like the Greater Toronto area and the Greater Vancouver area. And I think what's being built in those cities is maybe not the dream, but is what Canadians can afford.
So let's talk about that, the gap between what we can afford and what we are dreaming of. Does it make sense that builders should try to find a way to build more affordable single-family homes in the suburbs, since that's what people really want?
Well, I think that this is really a Toronto and Vancouver-centric issue. We have Canadian consumers all across the country. And if you go to other places, if you go to Alberta, if you go to Calgary, you go to Edmonton, you go to Ottawa, London, Kitchener, Waterloo, there's still many places where I think that the Canadian dream is alive and well, and it's still affordable. Mm-hmm. In terms of should builders build what Canadians want, I think as the cities of Toronto and Vancouver have grown, they're constrained by space, and to be able to afford houses for what people can actually afford, you have to go up. And that's the only way to make those houses affordable in the quantity that are required to build for the number of people moving to these cities. That
geographic reality is important to keep in mind, too. We hear pretty dire things, Benji, about a whole generation that won't be able to afford a home. Do you think that's also because we're kind of focused on these few big centers that do have pretty serious affordability issues, but elsewhere it might be a better story?
Well, I think it's definitely a better story elsewhere. So when we look at some of the other cities I mentioned, Ottawa, Calgary, Halifax, Edmonton, I think it still is within reach. If you're thinking of a city like Toronto, for example, the reality is for most young families, they have to go out. They have to go out. They have to go further afield. They have to go to Oshawa, maybe to Barrie, other places, Kitchener, Waterloo, if they want to be able to afford that dream. But let's compare what's happened to the city of Toronto over the last 25 or 30 years to other urban centers. I don't think also that, for instance, somebody who wants to live in, let's say, the Central Park in Manhattan, for example, would be able to afford to live in a 3-bedroom detached house right on Park Avenue. Right. As major cities around the world have densified, those cities have gone up. And I think we're seeing some of that happening in the major cities of Toronto and Vancouver. And those are the places where people are migrating to, because that's where a lot of the economic activity is happening.
So good to have you for this, Benji. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Benji Ketchen is CEO of Wahi. Time for the takeaway and relearning the 3 R's, that is, reduce, reuse, and recycle. In the context of human history, the environmental movement is still pretty young, really a byproduct of industrialization. Keeping our world clean and green has been a matter of trying to counteract all the so-called progress we humans have enjoyed. Of course, nowhere is that more obvious than the concern about climate change and our adaptation to it. But being good citizens of this planet also happens much closer to home. In Ottawa, a new limit on the number of items allowed in the trash on pickup day is intended to reawaken the first R, which in our world of conspicuous and often unthinking consumption seems to get a little lost in the shuffle. That we could actually do with less, that our footprint, not just on the planet, but literally on our own street and in our own home, could be smaller is a pretty important part of the equation. And since it's one that all of us can do all of the time, it's a shame we pay less attention to the reduce strategy than we might. Instead of finding ways to move around less, we're just greening our transportation system. And instead of being mindful of not needing so much stuff, we focus on how the items are shipped to us and how much packaging is involved. It's why initiatives like Ottawa's should be welcome. Of course, it may irritate people a little as they get used to it. Changing our behavior isn't easy. But given the collective importance, in this case, keeping Ottawa's landfill from overflowing, it's worth a little frustration to get to a worthy goal. It wouldn't be surprising if most cities in the Western world began a similar effort to shrink our trash output, and in fact, many already do. My takeaway? Human progress comes with many benefits, but also with some costs. And as with most debts, it's best to pay as you go. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.